Hi, everybody. Thank you
Hi.
so much for
Hello.
joining us. Hey, thank you so much for joining us for this panel entitled Change, Cancel Culture to Reform Culture. My name is Chelsea Taya, and I'm a creative executive at Sony Pictures Animation, as well as a member of the Brick Board. In this panel, we hope to address some questions such as, can we and should we shift cancel culture to reform culture? How can we determine what gets canceled and what happens after the moment of reckoning? Can we educate and repair? Just a reminder that after the panel, we will be splitting into breakout rooms and providing some questions for you to discuss with your group. After the breakout rooms, we will come back together as a larger group to recap. And now, please welcome your moderator, Emmy Award-winning producer and reporter, Suzanne Marquez.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm so excited to dive into this. Thank you for joining me, Dan, Ruben, Emmy, Leah, and interpreter, Kendra, being here as well, so we know what we are going to be saying and communicating this entire time. So let's just dive right in, because we had a little warm-up session about a week ago, so we've all gotten to be acquainted with one another. So can we just start with the question of cancel culture? It's such a hot button topic. What is the goal of it, and do you believe it's working?
I think I guess I could jump in, but I think that the goal of it is to send a message. I think the goal of it is intended to protect I don't know the right word, but the victim, the person who's on the receiving end of whatever the person who is canceled is. Now, the question of, is it working? I mean, I think that's what we're all here for. I would argue that it's not. I think if we're thinking about what the purpose of cancel culture is, I think it should also be a place for education, reformation, and rehabilitation. Now, is that happening within the context of how we define cancel culture? I would say no. And I think hopefully through this conversation, we could talk about how we get to that place.
Okay, because I like that you're just starting off with, it's a kind of an uncomfortable topic. It's not like cancel culture is the best thing that we all celebrate. Can we talk about some of the impacts for cancel culture, not just for perpetrators, but also if somebody tries to cancel somebody? Do you think there's blowback both ways? Whoever'd like to dive in.
Yeah, so I'm Emilea Kamemoto. I use she, her pronouns. I am a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant for Farzana Nayani Consulting and Training, as well as a coach and consultant for Defiant Changemakers, which is my organization. And some of the grounding that I have with Defiant Changemakers is like, we have the ability to make change. We have the ability to be and create the change that we want to see in the world. It's about unlocking what's blocking us from making that change, what's blocking us from feeling the agency to make that change. And I actually think this is really related to this conversation around cancel culture, because cancel culture, as we, Ruben, I remember in our first conversation around this, we started to define, what does cancel culture even look like? What is it? How is it impacting our communities? And one of the things that I've seen, I've also worked in the entertainment space as an executive in HR at CAA. And I get to talk with a lot of the agents there, a lot of the people who are working there about their clients and this fear about being canceled. Even anybody working in entertainment, putting themselves out there, right? There is a fear that I, in my work, can be canceled from what I believe and think. And it's been a tool that has been used in multiple ways. There's not really a space where I would say that cancel culture is absolutely evil, because in many places cancel culture has actually protected somebody from harm that was being done to them, saying like, I'm not going to work with this person anymore because harm is being done to me. That's one example of cancel culture, all the way to when we see someone creating a lot of harm, like sexual assault within the entertainment industry, and we say, we're canceling this person, we're not going to work with them, we're not going to have anything to do with them, right? There are benefits to that lead on to groups of people. So I want to say that there's two sides, because when we think about us being canceled, that seems like a really negative thing. Like, I don't want to be canceled. I don't want anybody here to be canceled. So the complexity of this conversation is something I'm really excited to dive into with Sarah and Ruben and Suzanne. And I think at this point in time, as I have even grown and learned from the conversation that we first had on this topic, I personally believe that cancel culture is a tool that makes us choose one side over the other. To say that one person is good and one person is bad, or one thing is good and one thing is bad. Mm-hmm. And I think that that doesn't even begin to cover the breadth of complexity within our world. If we just take our whole world and look at this is good, this is bad, then where do we all lie in that scale? I don't think any of us have ever gone through our careers saying, I've done everything perfectly, I've never hurt someone before, and everything's been dandy, right? So how do we go from a place of I've done something bad to I've done something bad and I want to do better, to now I know what not to do and to take action to move forward. And here I'm helping other people not be harmful. And that's kind of that restorative, transformative space that Ruben was just talking about. So those are some of the visions that I'm kind of seeing for cancel culture in the conversation around it. I know it wasn't directly answering your question, Suzanne, so I would love to come back to that too, but I thought that was like an important grounding here because it's not an easy yes or no, this is good or bad. Most of us in this room, especially if you're in entertainment, have sat someplace along the line in this conversation. And we've all been asking, what do we do here? And I think that we can collectively come to that space and that answer.
So I love the ideas you're talking about. I love giving examples as well. So we have people who have gone to prison, like Harvey Weinstein, and then we've had people who have said a really horrible tweet. Maybe not racist, maybe just insensitive, who have definitely been canceled, or maybe they've appropriated somebody else's culture. So there are gray areas, right? So how do we determine who is canceled and are they redeemable?
I think
that, oh, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. My name's Sarah. I had a little bit of a late start. I apologize. I was having technical issues. I'm sure you saw my wife trying to help me. I was freaking out. But I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me. I think too, like the pendulum, just to kind of go off the first question, the pendulum was so far in one direction, meaning we were so behind in ways of keeping people accountable that I think naturally we just swung the full other way. And then it was like, okay, accountability on, the most or on 100%, you know what I mean? And I think now we're realizing, oh yeah, to what Emmy was saying, this way of not acting isn't nothing, but now having the extremes and just putting you into two camps, it isn't helpful either. It's just the other side of extremism, right?
Yeah, I love that because I feel like what she was touching upon, we could all think of one memory where, oh, I deserve to be canceled for that one thing I did. But then we also have lived through times where I'm personally in my 40s. So I remember a time where Me Too didn't exist. So a lot of memories when I look back, it's like, oh, this person would have been canceled so long ago. So some people, it felt like they were overdue. Sometimes I see people getting canceled or people, there's so much, it's almost like, burning a witch at a stake before they've, had a chance to be redeemed. Ruben, let's talk about people who have been incarcerated, because to me, that's a perfect example of there are systems in our society, we're based on a puritanical America where we send people to prison, but in many ways it's a life sentence. You can't vote again once you have a felony. Sometimes it's a crime where somebody was abused as a child and they were, didn't have money and they're stealing, just to get by. There's other circumstances, so many layers, especially in families that experience extreme poverty and violence. So Ruben, can we talk about your experience?
Yeah, and maybe to contextualize my experience. So I'm a clinical psychologist. Part of my work is I work with homeless veterans who are dealing with addiction and trauma issues in a residential rehab program. That's one of the hats I wear. And so I come from a rehabilitation lens. And I think that I don't think we could talk about cancel culture without talking about rehabilitation. I think oftentimes the people who espouse cancel culture are the same people who espouse prison reform. And for me, they're one and the same. Because in the same way that we give people life sentences, cancel culture in some ways feels the same way. And I think there needs to be a bit more of a gradation, some gray areas. And I think it was you, Sarah, who alluded to, it's like, it's a very black and white way of approaching something. Sure, there are some things that are done that just absolutely need to be maybe canceled. There is no rehabilitating certain things. However, for the vast majority of life, for the vast majority of our experience, there's a huge gray area. I think about from the lens in which I operate. When somebody is in our residential program, it's okay, you do something bad, you relapse, there's something going on. Depending on if it's like really severe, we have to discharge you. It's not safe for the community. It's not safe for us. It's not safe for you to be in this setting. For a vast majority, though, we do what's called like a contract for success or grow or go. That sets the parameters by which success is demarcated, so that in order to show growth, these things have to happen and these things cannot happen. And I think there's a lens in which we need to apply that to this situation of how do we support, I come from the place of how do we support the perpetrator in order to educate, in order to change, in order to see something from a different perspective. Because without doing that, all we're doing is eliciting a shame response. And we can all resonate with that experience of when we feel shame, when we feel wrong. What do we do when that happens? We shut down, we isolate, we withdraw. And it creates that much more of an othering. If we want to invite people in, we have to allow people to contextualize things. And the only way to contextualize it is through conversation.
Yes, well, and since you raised the issue of prison, and by the way, my name is Dan Kovalik. I'm a law officer and I'm an author as well. I wrote the book, Cancel This Book, The Progressive Case. And prison raises the big issue. No one goes to prison because people say, oh, someone should go to prison. They have due process. They have a trial. They have a judge. They have a jury. And I think when we talk about people being canceled, particularly when it means them losing their jobs, their careers, we need to talk about due process. People need to have due process. And I think the Me Too movement is illustrative of this. So you had Harvey Weinstein, of course, who was on the extreme end. Horrible guy, should have been fired, should have gone to jail. He did go to jail after a trial. But then you had Al Franken, senator from Minnesota, liberal senator from Minnesota, probably one of the most liberal senators in the Senate. He lost his Senate seat. He was forced to resign because of allegations made against him during the Me Too movement. Turns out most people think that those allegations were trumped up, mostly by conservatives who wanted him out. Okay. He had offered, he said, hey, if you want to have a hearing to try me on these allegations, let's have that in the Senate. They said, no, just resign. That's what happened. It turns out, I think, that he was forced to resign improperly. And of course, we lost a great senator. So I think we need to talk about due process rights, particularly in the workplace. And we need to be careful that sometimes cancel culture is used not just to bring about good change. Sometimes it's used in a vindictive fashion, and we have to be honest about that. Sometimes it's being used for people to advance their own careers against other people. And so there needs to be checks and balances in due process. That's my big issue. And by the way, I was a union lawyer, and we had just cause for discharge. People could not just be fired. If you're represented by a union, you have to go to arbitration. And I think we need to think about those things when we talk about this.
Can I add one? Sorry.
Yeah, of course.
Susan, that reminds me of something else we talked about during our session, which is, even within the criminal system, we distinguish between like manslaughter and first or second degree murder. Like intent matters. Like the intent dictates the punishment in some ways. And we also need to take that into account when somebody does say something or do something that is negligent, ignorant, or just plain horrible. But we have to take into factor and have some sort of due process to recognize this level of nuance.
What is that quote? I think it's Maya Angelou. I may be misquoting whoever it is. The "when you know better, do better" quote. That's what I always think of, because oh, he grew up in another time, and she grew up in another time, like Paula Deen. I'm thinking of her right now. Should those people be canceled? Can they be redeemed? So many times, this is the one thing I will say as a journalist, because I cover all these stories. You never hear a full apology. And that's what always drives me crazy. Something happened last week where they still didn't get the full apology, instead of like, I'm sorry, that hurt somebody. It was Mayor Garcetti when he took off his mask, posed for a photo with Magic Johnson. How many of us have done that? And put it back on. He says, I don't know if he left it off the whole game at the SoFi Stadium, but he said, I took it off for a moment, 0% chance of getting COVID. I put it back on. Like, so sue me. If my child at school did that, they'd be sent home immediately. So I know there's so many layers to this. Is it because he's the mayor? Is it because he's in a position of power and kids are taught to just follow the rules? So many women have seen that the rules are different. Even with Al Franken, who has done wonderful things in his past, sees it as a hit job, right? But then some women see it differently. So I'd love to hear from some of the women, because we do experience less forgiveness when it comes to being canceled.
Yeah, Sarah, if you want to share first, I'd love for you to do so.
Yeah, this just kind of brings to mind the workplace for me and the different rules that I've noticed. I have a bold personality. I speak up, and I am loud. And sometimes I will say in my past, I've kind of, I'm somebody that walks the line in the sense of pushing back on power. And I've gotten some, feedback on my, my tone and how I address things and handle things. And then I see people who have, equal or more of an attitude or tone in me, who are men. And, the double standard is just always there, and you can see it. It's like, oh, that's in my review, and that's something that I'm getting feedback on. But then this person kind of can go longer or without it being addressed, and even when it is being brought up time and time again, for this certain person, I've noticed that that's a prime example that I can think of. But yeah, you get in the workplace, especially, that's where I have definitely seen the differences, and maybe not per se in cancel culture, but just in trying to cancel out that part of myself. And it's not read the same way when it's coming out of a woman's mouth than it is from a woman or gender nonconforming person.
I'm actually preparing a gender bias training right now for one of our clients, and the conversation that we have leading up to that presentation is to check in. What are some of the things that are coming up? What is the gender bias that's taking place? Is it against femme identifying folks or non-binary, etc.? We get some of the details there, but I think it's really, really fascinating to acknowledge that our genders is going to impact how the world views us, our mistakes, our actions, right? Because of gender bias. We're going to be judged on different scales. And then how do we redeem, right? We're coming to that question of how do we acknowledge the harm that has been done and move forward together as a community. Ideally, this is my sort of bias, is I'm going to go towards a route that is going to bring us together as a community versus ostracizing and alienating somebody. I think that we each know on an individual level that a core wounding or a core experience in our life is having been ostracized or pushed out of something, whether it was in a game on the playground when you were in 4th grade, or of an organization or a group that you might have founded and started, right? For something that you did, for some sort of behavior that you're not sure of. And that pain of being taken out of something, out of a group or a society, is one that oftentimes is going to align us to working with a group in a society. And so when we look at like restorative justice, transformative justice, there's I think the key difference between cancel culture and things like restorative justice and transformative justice is taking the time to acknowledge that some harm was done and actually sitting in that. As a DEI consultant, we're walking into a lot of situations where there is overt bias, racism, sexism, harm. And if we were to just pop in and be like, here's your training, here's how you be better, it doesn't make anything better within the organizations. We actually have to take time and listen to what harm has been done to employees, what has been experienced, and then sit in that, hold space in it for a minute and validate that was not okay. I'm sorry that you experienced that. And oftentimes there actually needs to be a level of acknowledgement for the perpetrator, the people who have been causing that harm, whether it's an organization's policies that end up causing harm, like a lack of pronoun conversation within an organization, for example, is something where there's no policy to say, oh, we need to use pronouns or we don't need to. What's the safety protocols around using pronouns in our names? And somebody inevitably gets hurt. But we need that organization to sit there and say, hey, we're sorry we didn't have some sort of guidance on this, or that we haven't talked about it to date. And then from that place of apology, recognition of the harm done, we can move forward to find a solution. And I think in cancel culture, kind of what Dan, you had mentioned, is like, it's that there's no moment to say what was done, where was harm caused. Is there a way that we can move through this together? Is the person who caused the harm willing to apologize and reconcile that they've done something? And then, as Maya Angelou says, know better, do better. Not everybody is going to do better. So at that point, then you get to decide, all right, am I going to engage with this person any longer, or am I going to exit? And that choice is something that each of us have individually. Am I going to engage in a space that is causing harm for me, or in a culture that is doing that, or am I going to exit? And in cancel culture, that nuance kind of gets left to some really pithy tweets sometimes, or things online. And I'm not saying that to at all say that the people who are speaking up are wrong or bad or anything by any means. We need to have a space and a container for those people to heal. And they shouldn't be the ones that have to deal with the person that's caused them harm. That's why there needs to be mediators and people in between, in my personal opinion, to help us get through that reconciliation process.
Yes.
I like this question from Ariel. Does a person's political affiliation affect how they view it? I mean, on one side, you can, I'm seeing this as ideas for questions. Woke Olympics is often used by a more privileged side of the conversation, just want to, cancel culture doesn't exist, right? Or that it's ridiculous. Like just, not even wanting to engage in a conversation is kind of, putting your head in the sand about it in general. But then, of course, there are people who are members of minorities and underrepresented communities who, you could cancel, somebody all day long. And at the same time, it's a beloved member of an underserved community or an underrepresented community. So there's more of a defensiveness about it. It's such a spectrum. So you talked about just acknowledging the hurt and how they can correct it, but feels like a lot of people who are still canceled haven't made that that bridge of connecting, of trying to repair it. Or I don't know, there might be some examples of people who have done some effort at trying to rebuild or reconnect, or some sort of apology. I'm trying to think of an example of somebody who's been canceled who has redeemed themselves, and they're sad examples like Britney Spears. It took a whole bunch of documentaries for people to see how she was victimized by members of the media, how she was questioned, the sexism, and how she was vilified for dressing provocatively, and that wasn't that long ago. And in so many words, you could say she was, canceled. Somebody who went into the industry as a child. How does somebody come out from the other side? I'm trying to think of people who have been canceled, who redeem themselves in a way that we could use as an example for others.
The only person that keeps coming to my mind is Aziz Ansari, with that issue that happened. And it was kind of one of those gray issues where people couldn't outright cancel him, but they wanted to. And, thinking of what you were saying, Suzanne, about underrepresented groups. And I know we talked about this when we had our meeting, but, who does cancel culture affect? Well, it's going to affect underrepresented groups and people who are marginalized by society more than white people, more than straight people, more than the people who hold positions of power. And Aziz Ansari was somebody who, you know, was making great content, and content that was just hitting so many different groups of people. And to have somebody like him canceled, I think he did he laid low. He made a statement. I can't remember if it was accepted or not. But, you know, I do see him coming back a little bit here and there. And I think that's a good example, but also it's the only person I could think of off the top of my head.
Right now, there's a lot of discussion about Dave Chappelle, which I haven't even dug into it because it's been a long week. But I know there's an effort that people are talking about right now about how he's speaking up about developments in his community, and people are debating it. And I even see an article right now from This American Life, which I just quickly looked out, guys. Thank you for sending it. It's a longer one. But Johnny Depp, here's that's an example. You know, Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, they both, you know, have accused each other of things. Johnny Depp's movies continue to be played. Meanwhile, Bill Cosby's shows have all been pulled off TV. Clearly, it's a different situation, absolutely. But when you look back,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. I was just gonna say, as we talked before when we had our little warm-up session, as we look back through history, the people who it's easier to cancel are communities that have already had a problem, kind of getting a leg up in society, pulling up their bootstraps, so to say. So it seems much easier for people to find options when you're part of a larger community. You have different areas where you can go, where when you finally make it and you're somebody who is from an underrepresented group, it makes it that tougher to bounce back.
I almost think that these are examples as why cancel culture doesn't actually work as a way to create safety that we're all looking for, right? Because cancel culture ultimately has been created, well, I've seen it shared as a tool for creating safety, right? Especially in communities with marginalized identities, being able to say, I cancel this thing or this person is a way to create a boundary. You cannot harm me anymore because I am not letting you within this range. I'm not going to do business with you, etc. Right? So it's a protection mechanism. And then on the other side, it severely impacts the person that is being canceled. And the truth is, with those people that are Black, brown, and hold other marginalized identities, cancel culture could mean that their career completely gets shut down and ended. And there might be more opportunities for people who have more privileges and power to redeem themselves, or to at least find business or have a safety net should cancel culture come to your window, to your door. I think it's difficult to say that it's political party versus, Democrats or Republicans that are experiencing like a higher rate of cancel culture and redemption and whatnot. And when we bring into the conversation, sorry, how am I blanking on this wonderful comedian's name that you just mentioned?
Dave Chappelle.
Dave Chappelle, right? So I say he's wonderful in many ways because he has done a lot of work that has been wonderful. And then many comments that he's had against the trans community or LGBTQIA plus community are harmful for that community. But we're also needing to look at the fact that in these two situations, it's not just Black and white and cancel culture, but we have an issue of anti-Blackness in this situation that's coming through, and situation of harming other communities, right? So the issues itself is not as easy to say, oh, we can cancel this person for what they said, because at the core of it, can we question, are we also potentially canceling these people because of an anti-Blackness sentiment that exists? Because we still haven't unpacked anti-Blackness or created a hard and fast rule of here's how you identify anti-Blackness, right? That's not going to happen as quickly as we wish it could. So that nuance and that complexity, again, makes it really hard to say who's the golden keeper of who gets to be canceled or not. I think that personally, it comes to each of us individually to decide what gets canceled, what doesn't, based on our own values, right? I could decide tomorrow I want to stop reading Harry Potter or watching the Harry Potter movies again because of what J.K. Rowling is saying, right? And I would also know that that would be very hard because at a time in my life when I needed just to escape and to find safety, Harry Potter was there for me. So how can I have that nuanced ability to say, I don't tolerate or agree with what J.K. Rowling is saying, and yet at the same time want to read her books or share that with my family. And then so again, it doesn't become this black and white space. Actually, I think one example right now that's been really present and top of mind is Aquafina. As you know, I'm a member of the Asian community. I've been active in the Asian entertainment spaces and advocating for us to be able to tell our nuanced story. There's this notion, well, the people are saying that Aquafina has appropriated a black scent and has been very successful because of her black scent. I could also look at this from a perspective as someone growing up as a marginalized identity within America and having to adopt certain traits and tools that would make people laugh, that would bring me safety in this growing up experience, whether it was aligning with whiteness if I was young when I was younger, or aligning to another larger community, because that brought me safety as a marginalized person. And then we can also ask, why is it that Aquafina, an Asian presenting woman with a black scent, is more palatable and more popular to America than a black person with a black scent? That is deeply rooted in white supremacy. So like all those levels, I like want, even if this conversation is to help us ask more questions, like what's at the core of this? Who's winning or who's benefiting from canceling this person, etc. Then we can begin to determine what we're okay with and what we're not.
I wonder if Dan or Ruben could speak to this. So Abby asked the question about a man who may have been accused falsely of, you know, I feel uncomfortable around this person, where it's kind of hard to pin that down. I have a colleague that's happened to, where somebody in power said they felt uncomfortable by something he said. It was taken up the channels and it was found to be not true. But that person, because she didn't like the way this man spoke up, and he is from a marginalized community, but it could be a white, it could be any kind of man, but it's different when it's a man and a woman alone in a room, but felt uncomfortable. And then all of a sudden it became a formal complaint and threatened his job. And, you know, Ruben, working with people who have PTSD, you know, there are certain triggers that can make people lash out. Dan, you've clearly studied it. Can we talk about that, how people could be canceled that way?
Yeah, well, I think the one thing, again, in the law that we talk about, and I think it applies here, is you talk about things can't always be merely subjective, because as you say, people have different tolerance levels that come from different places. Usually there's this idea that there's a reasonable subjective feeling. That is to say, we have to look at things a bit objectively, like would the average person be offended by this thing? It's one cannot simply say I'm offended, and by saying that, even if it's true that they feel offended, that it would indict someone successfully. And in the case you mentioned, there was some due process that went up the chain. They looked at it. They thought this either didn't happen, or what did happen, again, was not enough to rise to the level that we think a reasonable person would be offended by that. And I do think you have to look at that, because otherwise you can just, again, have someone indicted, I think, too easily. And I think we, you know, and I do, by the way, I want to mention Dave Chappelle, because the Dave Chappelle, the latest controversy, I think is illustrative of a lot of these things. So what people are being told is that he used his status and his money to keep low-income housing from being built in Yellow Springs. What Dave Chappelle is saying, no, I didn't do that. I went to the hearing and said, you real estate company that claims you're bringing low-income housing, I don't think you're doing that. You're mostly bringing in high-income, high-rent housing. You're a fraud. That's why I don't support you. Now, those are two very different things, but the line that we're getting is that he is against low-income housing, when that may not be the case. So I just think, you know, we always have to take a step back when these claims are being made. And again, need to give people a proper airing for their considerations. And I'll just say one last thing. Someone mentioned a very important thing, you know, that they don't think necessarily that this cancel culture is making, you know, changes that we want to see. in our society. And I would say it's not calculated to, because cancel culture is focusing on one bad individual at a time, one bad apple at a time. It's not intended to fight the system, right? And so given that it's not intended to do that, it won't result in it. I don't think it's the effective tool to do that. I will just throw that out there.
I've seen that discourse because people have talked about Joe Rogan, for example. It's like, okay, it's Joe Rogan today. Okay, he's going to go off Spotify. You won that battle, but did you actually change anything? I mean, there's a lot of people, you bring up an example, and is it changing the worldview? Not necessarily. It's like, okay, we're piling on this person that we're, ringing the shame bell, putting them in the street. Okay, they're just going to hop on another platform that might be more extreme. There are new media channels popping up all the time that are more polarizing. Facebook feeds us stories that are intended to be what we want to see. For example, being a journalist, I don't usually post many political articles on Facebook, but when Kamala Harris became vice president, I was like, oh, wow, a woman is vice president. I put that one article. All I saw for a week were Kamala Harris articles, which I didn't have a problem with, but it really showed me staying out of the algorithm. You jump in with anything that's slightly polarizing, you just get surrounded by the same confirming stories. The confirmation bias just gets kicked into high gear. So social media is not the place for this kind of discussion, which is, it's like we're fighting against David and Goliath, right? We're trying to open our minds here and think of different people's experiences. And thank goodness, people writing books and working with specific, groups and companies and people and being, having a strong voice. It's showing examples of that. But that's my fear with cancel culture, is that social media is just so powerful that, like you said, Dan, it's kind of picking and choosing, but is it really opening people's minds and making them more empathetic, or, looking at a full story instead of clickbait?
And I think, to your point, like, it puts tunnel vision, it puts blinders on your life and your perspective, and it reinforces the subjective experience and devalues maybe a more objective reality. And I think at the end of the day, we have to take responsibility for our own reaction, our own biases, our own life and lived experience. In this world where there are, so much on Instagram and social media about take care of yourself and the trauma-informed care and having a really healthy boundaries and all these things, all that stuff is good. And also, not everything is, people aren't responsible all the time for your reaction too. It's not to say that it's not valid, right? There's a difference between something not being valid and something just maybe not being part of the whole picture. And that's why I think when we talk about cancel culture, there's two pieces of it. How do we support the person who was victimized, and how do we support the perpetrator? Because as Dan is saying, the system's not being changed. It's sort of like you're putting out little fires, but at the end of the day, there's still global warming happening, right? Mm-hmm. Like it doesn't change the system. And we have to look at our own scars and our own wounds that are also being triggered in the midst of these things that are being canceled. I might have a bruise or a scar on my left arm. Emmy might have a scar on her leg, right? When something happens, it might trigger me, but not trigger Emmy because I have a scar in the place in which that happened. So now that's going to become irritated and, God forbid, infected and so on and so forth. But if I don't go in and treat that, that's never going to be treated and dealt with. So things that happen around me are going to constantly impact that wound. And at some point, we also take responsibility for our wound, and we have to take responsibility and the perpetrator also has to take responsibility for their wound that caused whatever harm, intended or unintended harm. Because the reality is hurt people too. And it's not to say that it's the victim's responsibility to fix that, but we need to include that as part of the larger conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it just gets me thinking because it does have to do with generations as well. For example, I grew up watching The Cosby Show because I'm that generation. I remember Michael Jackson as a kid. And one of my my co-anchor at work, he's Black. And if you talk about the Cosby Show and Michael Jackson, it's viewed through a different lens than somebody who isn't in the Black community, because there are so few shows. I mean, Cosby Show is off the air. You don't see it anywhere now. And I did watch, I've listened to the podcasts, and it's heartbreaking, especially watching the shows now. Michael Jackson, as you know, Ruben, buried memories, and, kids testifying when they were 9 years old, testifying 20 years later, you're going to remember more, especially if you've been through therapy. But there are certain people see it as an attack on an entire culture. Like, you're canceling also a generation, you're canceling memories of a generation, you're canceling stars when you have so few that were beloved around the world. I can't think of the last star or even a current star who's as big as Michael Jackson. So for some communities, it feels different when somebody's canceled versus, if somebody is critical of Reaganomics and they hate Ronald Reagan. Well, there's 99% of the other presidents are white men, so they're good. There's somebody else they can look up to. So it's that kind of feeling of, we have few heroes. So how do we handle those kind of things, especially when we look through history? And we're not even given the full history. That's a whole other conversation, and that could be a whole other hour of the amount of information we're fed through schools. Are things canceled for good? Can we bring them back? Do we just put an asterisk next to their name? Sarah? I'm like, anybody. I'm like
just a part of Wikipedia that drops down. You want more information on this person? Here it is.
Well,
right. And this brings a question to my mind, a question to your question of yeah, what do we do? Are these people canceled forever? What happens? But think about being a kid. I'm turning 40 this year, and I remember how much anxiety I had being a kid, just because Emmy was saying, you don't know what's happening in the politics. One day you're in, one day you're out, somebody's not talking to you, and it's so anxiety driven, and it shaped my behavior. It kept me closeted. It kept me not acknowledging that I was neurodivergent. It shaped my life in such a way that oppressed me and who I could have been, right? Because I had no examples of that. So imagine now you're a kid and you want to do social justice work, or you want to, I remember I was young and I was the kid that stood up for people because that's who I was. And did I do it right? No, I swore, I screamed, I did it all wrong. But the point was made, hey, you can't say that to that person. You know what I mean? And imagine now being a kid and you're too anxiety driven to even make a move left or right or any way, because you're so scared of what you don't know and how maybe you could be perceived. I just imagine it would be so stifling. And what is cancel culture doing to, the generations that are, living on the internet? I imagine it's not going to have a positive outcome, because we've got people who probably have a lot of good to say that just won't say it because they're too scared.
Yes, I've talked with my friends a million times about, if social media existed, I would have been canceled. Absolutely. You think of somebody recording when you're in a car and you're singing along with a song, or you're making a joke, yes, it's we have laws against children under 18 having any sort of, nudity on the internet, their social media. I know there was a boy who was canceled from American Idol because he made some racist comments when he was, I think, 14 or 15. And that he was canceled. I mean, but before he even turned 18, that just didn't sit right with me, that it almost felt like his future was decided for him before he was 18. Clearly the influences of adults had something to do with it. Just like the Russian skater today, I think she's 15, who was accused of doping. Is she canceled? She was, under the tutelage of a coach.
And thank you so much for this conversation. I do want to make sure that we are having some time for the breakout rooms. You all have been killing it. Thank you so much.
I think this conversation could go on forever. And
hours. Love it.
It's amazing.
Time already.
Right. Well, so what's going to happen now is we are going to go into our breakout rooms, and we're all going to be talking together about those questions of, You have harmed someone. What are the steps to come back? You have been harmed. What are those steps?